I'm outside Osgoode Hall in downtown Toronto just after day 2 of the carbon tax court reference taking place, wherein the Ontario government challenging the constitutionality of the federal government's Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. This was the day where the federal government ultimately put forward its defense against the challenges that were put forward on day 1, Monday, by Ontario's lawyer. And what was interesting is it was a far more spirited exchange than Monday's in many respects, with several questions put by a number of the justices on the Court of Appeal dais, basically asking for an answer to the question of where the limitation of the federal government's power is likely to be if the federal government's argument is accepted. And here's one clip of that exchange.
We're trying to pin you down on what the matter of this is. If it is reduction of greenhouse gases, if that's what the purpose of this is, that suggests a much wider lawmaking authority than simply establishing a pricing regime. And that's what we heard from your friends yesterday. And you haven't, for my satisfaction at least, dealt with that problem. I don't know where this begins and ends in terms of if this act is constitutional and it's upheld on the basis that the subject matter is a national concern, POGG matter of reducing greenhouse gases. I'm not sure how much further you can go. But I do suggest to you, and I've tried to suggest this morning, if this only addresses a quarter of the greenhouse gas problem, you're going to want to do more federally. And so I want to know where that begins and ends in terms of your jurisdiction to do that federally. Your friend says it extends rights to whether or not homeowners can have wood-burning fireplaces. Do you say yes, or are they wrong in that? I need to know that.
Well, we think in the abstract that would be beyond federal reach under the POG power. But again, the limits come from the case-by-case analysis and from the application of the pith and substance doctrine, from the rigor of the national concern test, and from the evidence that's required to demonstrate that it is substantively directed towards addressing that national concern at a national level. The dividing line is that legislation must be addressing the national aspects of the problem.
Now, as you can see there in that clip, we don't necessarily have a clear answer, or at least not an answer that the justice is accepting as meeting the threshold he thinks need to be set by this. And I want to play another clip for you as well that speaks to, again, that spirited nature of today's proceedings. This is Justice McPherson asking why pricing in the eyes of the federal government is the be-all and end-all for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
But over a 14-year period, Ontario emissions are down 22%.
Ontario has definitely achieved reductions, and largely through the closure of coal-fired emissions.
We don't care how they achieve it. They've achieved reductions of 22%. Why don't you just leave them alone? Ontario has had a great result, not in 1 year, over a 14-year period.
Ontario has had great results. Unfortunately, Ontario can do nothing about what is happening in other provinces.
So Ontario has to pay an extra burden because other provinces are failing?
So I'm not sure why don't you leave them alone is a legal argument, but it speaks to what I think Ontario is pushing for, which is a clear answer from the federal government on why provinces cannot be left to their own devices, especially if, in the case of Ontario, they're having some success at reducing emissions. I remind you that Ontario's emissions in the last 14 years have gone down 22%, and they've done this without a carbon price. But unfortunately, this doesn't actually give them any credit or curry any favor with the federal government. So a lot of the discussion today was centered on this idea of the urgency of climate action by governments, and the federal government's claim that no province could deal with this in isolation. They all have to work together, and if one doesn't do it, the others are going to suffer. Now, this is the fundamental defense that the federal government is putting forward here. However, I do have to point out that one of the big challenges is that the government's only answer to how it limits its own power is just trust us. The federal government's lawyer said that the federal government is able to, in future legislation, put limits to the legislation in the legislation, basically putting forward the argument that even if the federal government is, in this case, given carte blanche to claim provincial jurisdiction, it's not going to cause provinces to lose their autonomy in the future. And this was, we saw, a bit of a sticking point with some of the justices. Now, look, the federal government's going to have an opportunity to speak again on Thursday, and the provincial government will also have the opportunity to speak on Thursday. But it was very interesting to see that the judges, at least in their questions, now this doesn't mean they've drawn conclusions, this means they're probing to get an answer, but the judges did not seem to have their challenges satisfied, except for after they had put them to Canada's lawyer several times over. So that'll be something to watch. And again, you can't extrapolate from a judge asking a question or two or four that a judge has necessarily concluded something. They're playing devil's advocate. They could be just genuinely trying to get an answer on the record. But if those are any indication, it shows that there was a lacking of clarity from Canada's position on this that was not really matched from Ontario on day one. Because the day wrapped up a little bit early, we got a bit of a head start on things that are supposed to be happening on Wednesday. New Brunswick led off with its support of Ontario's position, and we know that on Wednesday, British Columbia, which is taking the Canadian government's side, will be intervening, and Saskatchewan, which is standing up for Ontario, will be intervening as well. 2 days to go of this. For True North, I'm Andrew Lawton.